Imagine a place where human beings were stored like cargo in spaces measuring exactly 5 feet by 7 feet. 35 square feet of stone and iron that housed up to 3 grown men at a time, where the only light came from a narrow slot near the ceiling and the only privacy was death itself. The West Virginia Penitentiary cost the state $247,000 to build in 1876. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $6 million in today's currency. But the real cost wasn't measured in money. It was measured in the systematic destruction of human dignity, carried out with architectural precision for nearly a century. Built on a hill that had served as a Native American burial ground, this Gothic fortress was designed to project absolute authority over the Ohio River Valley. But something went wrong with the machine. The walls that were meant to contain chaos began generating their own brand of horror. Guards reported unexplained sounds echoing through empty corridors, doors opening and closing by themselves, and Cell 47, which became known throughout the facility as the Poltergeist cell, where the building itself seemed to remember every scream, every beating, every moment of despair that had soaked into its stones. Today, we're opening the classified files, the hidden maintenance reports, and the suppressed medical records that reveal how a structure designed to impose order became a pressure cooker that transformed both prisoners and guards into something they never intended to become. This isn't just the story of a prison. This is the forensic autopsy of an institution that died from its own cruelty, leaving behind a building that still echoes with the voices of the damned. Join us as we walk through the corridors of America's most haunted penitentiary and discover what happens when architecture becomes evil. In the early hours before dawn, when the Ohio River runs black as coal tar and the fog rolls thick as cotton batting, there stands a thing that should not be. Perched on a hill above Moundsville, West Virginia, its Gothic towers pierce the morning mist like the spires of some medieval cathedral built for a god of iron and stone. But this is no house of worship. This is the West Virginia Penitentiary, and it has been watching the town below for more than a century. From the river's edge, you can see how the architects positioned it. Every angle calculated, every sight line measured. The building commands the high ground like a fortress, its crenellated walls rising 60 feet above the street level. When the fog lifts and sunlight strikes those sandstone blocks, they gleam pale yellow, the color of old bones. And when the wind is right, when it carries sound down that hill the way water flows downhill, you can hear what goes on behind those walls. You always could. The acoustics were no accident. Sound travels in predictable ways, and the men who designed this place understood that fear, like water, seeks the lowest point. A scream from the execution chamber could reach Main Street on a quiet night. A gunshot from the exercise yard would echo off the hillside and roll through the residential blocks like thunder. The people of Moundsville would lie in their beds and know, without seeing, what their tax dollars had built on the hill above them. But if sound escapes this easily, traveling down that slope and into the dreams of sleeping townspeople, what else might find its way out? What else might the building release into the world when the pressure inside becomes too much to contain? The land remembers. Long before the first stone was quarried, before the first iron bar was forged, this hill held secrets. The Adena people knew it as a burial ground, their earthworks rising in careful mounds along the river's bend. When European settlers arrived, they found arrowheads in the soil and fragments of pottery glazed black with age. The early surveys, conducted in the 1850s, noted extensive indigenous earthworks and subsurface anomalies consistent with pre-Columbian habitation. But by 1866, when the state legislature authorized construction of a new penitentiary, such details had become inconvenient. The Adena mounds were leveled, the burial sites were paved over. The past was scraped away to make room for the future, a future built on the principle that some people deserve to be buried alive. The engineering reports tell their own story. Soil samples revealed unstable pockets throughout the construction site, areas where the earth had been disturbed and refilled centuries earlier. The chief engineer, a man named Harrison Clark, wrote in his final assessment that the foundation work will require extensive reinforcement in sectors 7 through 12. But reinforcement costs money, and the legislature had already exceeded its initial budget authorization by 30%. So they compromised. They reinforced the sections that would bear the most weight: the cell blocks, the administrative wing, the execution chamber. The rest they left to chance and time. Clark's final notation, buried in the appendices of his report, reads simply, "Structural integrity assured for 25 years under normal operational parameters." He did not define what constituted normal parameters. He did not account for overcrowding. He did not imagine that a building designed to hold 480 men would one day house nearly 2 euro. They built a prison on unstable ground and called it stable. They built it without accounting for its own success. They built a machine with no off switch. The political pressure had been building since the end of the Civil War. West Virginia, carved from Virginia during the conflict, needed to establish its legitimacy as a state. Crime rates were climbing, or seemed to be climbing, in the industrial river towns. The newspapers demanded action. The legislators demanded solutions, and the solution they settled upon was absolute: a penitentiary so imposing, so inescapable, that the mere sight of it would deter crime throughout the region. The debates in Charleston went on for months: committee hearings, budget reviews, architectural competitions. The winning design came from a firm in Baltimore that specialized in institutional buildings, poorhouses, asylums, and prisons. They promised a structure that would project moral authority through architectural grandeur. They promised walls that would render escape not merely difficult but psychologically inconceivable. Schaubberts. What they delivered was a Gothic fortress that belonged to another century. Sandstone blocks quarried from the hills of Pennsylvania, each weighing more than a ton. Iron bars forged in Pittsburgh foundries and shipped down the Ohio River on coal barges. Lock mechanisms imported from England, where prison design had been perfected in service of an empire that understood the necessity of containing troublesome populations. The funding debates revealed the legislature's true priorities: $15,000 approved for stonework, $8,000 for ironwork, $12,000 for the execution chamber, with its specially designed gallows and electrical systems for future upgrades, but only $3,000 allocated for what the budget called prisoner amenities: plumbing, heating, and ventilation for the cells themselves. The cell dimensions were finalized during a single afternoon session in April 1867: 5 feet by 7 feet, 35 square feet per man, no windows except a narrow slot near the ceiling, no plumbing except a bucket, no heating except what little warmth might seep through the stone walls from the corridors. Committee member Jonathan Wheeling raised concerns about these specifications. His notes, preserved in the state archives, record his question: "Are we housing men or storing cargo?" The response came from committee chairman Robert Trent: "Mr. Wheeling, these men have forfeited their claim to comfort. The purpose of incarceration is punishment, not hospitality." Those dimensions, 5 by 7 feet, would define everything that followed: every moment of madness, every act of violence, every ghost story whispered by guards working the night shift. 35 square feet repeated 680 times, creating a honeycomb of human storage that would concentrate suffering with scientific precision. The builders knew these cells were inadequate. The contractors knew they were temporary. Everyone involved understood that the legislature would eventually appropriate funds for expanded facilities, improved conditions, and humane reforms. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when changing course requires admitting mistakes, and admitting mistakes requires a kind of courage that rarely survives contact with politics and budgets. The construction itself was a monument to 19th century certainty. Hand-cut sandstone blocks, fitted without mortar in some sections, held together by gravity and compression. Iron window frames forged to tolerances measured in fractions of inches. Oak timber imported from Virginia forests, seasoned for 2 years before installation. They built it to last centuries, these men who thought they were building for decades. But even as the walls rose, problems emerged. The local stone proved softer than anticipated, more porous than specified. Water intrusion began before the roof was complete. The iron fittings, exposed to mountain humidity, showed signs of surface rust within 6 months. The foundation settling was uneven, causing stress fractures in the load-bearing walls before the first prisoner arrived. The chief contractor, William Hayes, filed 17 separate change orders requesting additional funds to address these issues. 16 were denied. His final report, submitted with obvious resignation, noted that the structure meets minimum specifications but cannot be guaranteed beyond normal operational parameters. That phrase again, normal operational parameters, as if anyone could predict what normal might mean in a place designed to contain chaos. The execution chamber presented its own acoustic challenges. Positioned at the center of the complex, it was designed to serve as both operational necessity and psychological weapon. Every prisoner would pass its doors daily. Every guard would hear the testing of equipment. Every visitor would know that death lived at the heart of this machine. During the initial sound tests conducted in November 1875, engineers discovered that the chamber's stone walls created an echo that lasted 37 seconds. A single handclap would bounce between the walls, growing softer but never quite dying, like a heartbeat gradually slowing to silence. The chief architect noted this effect with clinical precision. Acoustic properties exceed design specifications. Recommend sound dampening modifications. Well, the modifications were never funded. The echo remained, an architectural accident that would become psychological torture. The electrical systems installed in preparation for future electrocutions created their own problems. The prison's power grid, designed in 1876, could not have anticipated the demands of electric execution. When the chair was finally installed in 1951, it required such massive voltage that lights throughout the facility would dim during testing. Power surges became routine. Electrical fires in adjacent cells were documented 17 times between 1951 and 1979. Every execution would announce itself through the building's electrical system. The lights would flicker, the fans would slow, and in the cells nearest the chamber, men would lie in darkness and count the seconds until the power returned, knowing that somewhere in that darkness a life had been measured in volts and amperes. The cost overruns were spectacular even by government standards. The initial appropriation of $89 had grown to $247 by completion, nearly triple the authorized amount. Adjusted for inflation, that $247 represents approximately $2 million in today's currency. They had built the most expensive structure in West Virginia history, and they had built it wrong. The maintenance contracts, negotiated separately, revealed the scope of the problem. Annual repairs were projected at $3 approximately 75 dollars in modern terms. But those projections assumed normal wear and tear. They did not account for deliberate damage. They did not factor in overcrowding. They did not anticipate the cumulative effects of rage and desperation on stone and steel. The first maintenance logs, begun in January 1876, documented problems that would plague the facility for the next century. Water intrusion in the east wing, settling cracks in the foundation, rust bloom on iron fittings, mortar failure in load-bearing walls. Each entry a small prediction of the catastrophes to come. But the most significant cost could not be calculated in dollars. It could only be measured in the space between those walls, 5 feet by 7 feet, repeated endlessly. Each cell a pressure cooker designed to transform human beings into something else entirely. On January 3, 1876, the first prisoners arrived at the West Virginia Penitentiary. 37 men transported by rail from the old state prison in Wheeling, their ankle shackles clanking against the iron steps as they climbed down from the cars. The temperature was 14 degrees below zero. Snow covered the exercise yard. The heating system, such as it was, had not yet been tested under operational conditions. The iron doors closed for the first time that afternoon. Each door weighed 180 pounds and moved on hinges designed to last a century. The sound they made, that deep, reverberating clang, would become the heartbeat of the institution. 680 doors, opening and closing in carefully timed sequences, marking the passage of days and years and decades with mechanical precision. The execution chamber received its final acoustic test on January 15th, 2 weeks after opening. A single gunshot fired into a sandbag to simulate the sound of the coming hangings. The echo lasted 34 seconds, 3 seconds shorter than the empty chamber test, because the presence of 37 prisoners had changed the building's acoustic properties, their breathing, their heartbeats, their whispered prayers and muffled curses. The building had learned to absorb human sound. But some sounds, it seemed, the building could not absorb. Some echoes would last longer than 34 seconds. Some would last longer than a lifetime. Some would outlive the men who made them, outlive the guards who heard them, outlive everyone except the stones themselves. The clock had started ticking. Time would pass differently here, measured not in hours and days, but in footsteps and lockdowns, in the rhythm of count and recount, in the endless repetition of routines designed to break the human spirit through sheer, grinding monotony. The machine was operational. The experiment had begun, and high on the hill above Moundsville, behind walls of stone and iron, 37 men learned what it meant to disappear from the world while still drawing breath. They learned that punishment could be measured in cubic feet. They learned that suffering could be calculated with architectural precision. They learned that some buildings remember everything. The machine operated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the subtlety of a sledgehammer. At 5, onto 30 hours hin. Each morning, the steam whistle mounted on the south tower would shriek across the valley, its blast audible 3 miles away in downtown Moundsville. The sound served multiple purposes. It woke the prisoners, it announced the start of another day to the townspeople below, and it reminded everyone within earshot that the prison never slept. By 1880, the daily routine had crystallized into an unbreakable pattern. 5:45. Cell doors opened in sequence, beginning with Block A and proceeding alphabetically through the complex. Each door required a specific key, turned in a specific sequence by guards who walked predetermined routes at predetermined speeds. The entire unlocking process took exactly 17 minutes. Timed, recorded, and optimized for efficiency rather than humanity. The prisoners would emerge into corridors lit by gas lamps that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. The flagstone floors, worn smooth by thousands of shuffling feet, reflected the light in patterns that seemed to shift with each passing figure. Morning count began immediately. 1. 247 prisoners by 1885. 1. 689 by 1892. 1. 943 by 1901. Each man assigned a number that would follow him through every meal, every work detail, every moment of his incarceration. The guards who supervised this daily resurrection had their own routines, their own keys, their own routes through the maze of corridors and stairwells. Captain William Morrison, who served from 1878 to 1903, walked the same path every morning for 25 years, down the main corridor, past the execution chamber, up the iron stairs to the second-tier cells, along the catwalk that stretched above the exercise yard like a bridge between two versions of hell. Morrison's logbooks, preserved in the state archives, document the gradual erosion of hope with bureaucratic precision. Prisoner 1247 found unresponsive in cell. Wait. Prisoner 0891 attempted self-harm with contraband materials. Disturbance in Block C resolved through disciplinary measures. Each entry a small tragedy reduced to administrative language, filed away and forgotten. The footsteps of the guards became a kind of timekeeping for the prisoners. Captain Morrison wore iron-soled boots that rang against the stone floors with metronomic regularity. The prisoners learned to measure time by his pace. 7 steps to pass their cell, 14 steps to reach the corner, 43 steps to complete his circuit of the second tier. His rhythm became their clock, his presence their calendar, his absence their only respite from surveillance. Some cells never received direct sunlight. The architects had positioned the buildings to maximize security rather than illumination, creating interior blocks where natural light never penetrated. Prisoners in these cells lived in perpetual twilight, their days measured not by the movement of sun and shadow, but by the artificial rhythms imposed by gas lamps and guard rotations. The psychological effects were documented by Dr. Samuel Jenkins, the prison's first physician, who served from 1879 to 1887. His medical reports described symptoms that would later be recognized as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and what we now understand as post-traumatic stress. But in the 1880s, such conditions were dismissed as malingering or moral weakness. Dr. Jenkins prescribed cold baths and increased workloads for men whose minds were already fracturing under the weight of isolation and monotony. Time began to warp inside those walls. Men who had lived their entire lives governed by sunrise and sunset, by seasons and weather, found themselves suspended in an artificial environment where day and night were determined by administrative convenience rather than natural law. The confusion was deliberate. Disorientation was considered a feature, not a flaw, of the correctional system. The locking mechanisms told their own story of gradual decay and improvised solutions. The original locks, imported from England in 1875, were marvels of Victorian engineering. Each lock contained 47 separate components, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The keys were works of art, hand-forged steel decorated with brass inlays, each one unique, each one irreplaceable. But by 1890, many of those original keys had been lost, stolen, or damaged beyond repair. The prison's blacksmith shop began producing replacements, but these crude copies lacked the precision of the originals. Gaps appeared in the security system, keys that opened multiple cells, locks that could be bypassed with improvised tools, mechanisms that failed under stress. The unofficial key-making operation became an open secret among the staff. Guards would commission duplicate keys to speed up their rounds. Maintenance workers created master keys to simplify repairs. Even some trustees, prisoners granted special privileges, possessed keys that could open sections of the facility. The system designed to ensure perfect control had evolved into something approaching chaos, held together by habit and fear rather than mechanical precision. By 1895, the prison's chief engineer estimated that more than 200 unofficial keys were in circulation. Some had been sold to corrupt guards. Others had been traded for favors or contraband. A few had simply disappeared into the stone walls and iron bars of the building itself, lost in the daily shuffle of maintenance and routine, waiting to be discovered by someone with the patience to search and the desperation to use them. Security, the administrators learned, was an illusion maintained by the consent of both the watchers and the watched. When that consent began to erode, the locks and keys and cameras became mere theater, props in a performance that everyone knew was failing. Solitary confinement emerged as the prison's answer to every disciplinary problem. The original plans had included 12 isolation cells, designed for temporary punishment and administrative segregation. But by 1885, demand for solitary exceeded capacity by a factor of 4. Temporary isolation became extended isolation. Extended isolation became indefinite isolation. Indefinite isolation became a kind of living death. The isolation cells measured 4 feet by 6 feet, even smaller than the regular cells if such a thing were possible. No windows, no furniture except a concrete slab that served as both bed and toilet. No human contact except for the daily delivery of bread and water through a slot in the door. Men were held in these conditions for weeks, sometimes months, emerging only for medical emergencies that could not be ignored. Dr. Jenkins documented the progression of psychological breakdown in his isolation patients with clinical detachment. Day 1. Subject exhibits normal responses to confinement. Day 7. Subject reports auditory hallucinations. Day 14. Subject found speaking to invisible companions. Day 21. Subject requires physical restraints to prevent self-harm. Day 30. Subject no longer responds to direct questions. The hallucinations were remarkably consistent across different prisoners and different time periods. Men would report conversations with deceased relatives, childhood friends, or former cellmates. They would describe elaborate scenarios playing out in the darkness of their cells, entire lifetimes lived in the space between sleeping and waking. Some claimed to leave their bodies, to float above the prison and look down at the complex from impossible heights. The medical staff dismissed these reports as symptoms of mental illness, but the consistency of the experiences suggested something else. The human mind, when deprived of external stimulation, begins to generate its own reality. The darkness of solitary confinement became a canvas on which desperate men painted impossible worlds. But the most unsettling reports came from prisoners who claimed to sense presences in their isolation cells, not visions or voices, but the unmistakable feeling that they were not alone. They would describe cold spots in the corners, sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, and the persistent sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. These reports were filed away and forgotten, dismissed as the ravings of men whose minds had snapped under pressure. But they accumulated in the medical files, like sediment in a river bottom. Layer upon layer of testimony that something unnatural was happening in the deepest, darkest corners of the West Virginia Penitentiary. The execution chamber operated with the mechanical efficiency that characterized every aspect of the institution. Hangings were scheduled for Friday mornings at precisely 10 o'clock, allowing time for the body to be removed and the chamber cleaned before the noon meal. The procedure had been refined through practice and repetition until it resembled an industrial process more than a judicial proceeding. The condemned man would be awakened at 5 a.m., allowed a final meal, and permitted visits from clergy or family members until 9:30. At 9:45, he would be escorted from death row to the execution chamber, a walk of exactly 73 steps that had been measured and timed by prison officials seeking to optimize the process. The distance was short enough to prevent escape attempts, but long enough to ensure that every prisoner in the facility could hear the footsteps of the condemned man making his final journey. The electrical systems installed for future electrocutions created problems that the 1876 architects could never have anticipated. The prison's power grid, originally designed to support gaslighting and basic machinery, struggled under the massive electrical demands of the execution equipment. Voltage irregularities became routine. Power failures occurred during the most sensitive moments of the process. The electrical upgrades, completed in 1951, required rewiring large sections of the facility. Old gas lines were converted to electrical conduits. New junction boxes were installed in cell blocks that had been constructed 75 years earlier. The marriage of Victorian architecture and modern electrical systems created a hybrid monster that functioned poorly and failed frequently. Power surges became a fact of life at the West Virginia Penitentiary. During execution preparations, lights throughout the facility would dim and flicker as massive amounts of electricity flowed toward the death chamber. Air circulation fans would slow to a stop. Electric clocks would reset, and in the cells nearest to the execution chamber, prisoners would lie in darkness and wait for the lights to return, knowing that their return would signal the completion of another state-sanctioned killing. The acoustic effects of the electrical system were equally disturbing. The massive transformers required for electrocution would emit a low, grinding hum that could be felt through the stone walls as much as heard. The sound would begin an hour before the scheduled execution, as technicians tested and calibrated the equipment. It would continue through the procedure itself, a mechanical accompaniment to the most primal of human dramas. 17 separate electrical fires were documented in cell blocks adjacent to the execution chamber between 1951 and 1979. Most were small affairs: smoldering insulation, overheated wiring, blown fuses that sent showers of sparks into the corridors. But each fire represented a failure of the system, a reminder that the building's electrical grid was operating at the edge of its capacity. The prisoners learned to read the electrical system like a language. The quality of the light in their cells would tell them whether an execution was scheduled. The behavior of the fans would predict power failures. The hum of the transformers would announce that death was being prepared just a few dozen yards away, separated from their own cells by nothing more than stone walls that seemed increasingly thin. The guards who worked the night shifts told different stories than their colleagues who worked during the day. Captain Morrison's detailed logbooks, maintained with military precision for 25 years, recorded the routine disturbances that characterized prison life: fights between prisoners, contraband discoveries, disciplinary infractions that required documentation and response. But the night guards reported experiences that found no place in official records. Officer Thomas Reed, who worked the midnight to 8 shift from 1889 to 1907, kept an unofficial journal that came to light only after his death. His entries describe sounds that had no obvious source: footsteps in empty corridors, voices from unoccupied cells, the distinct sound of iron doors opening and closing in wings that had been locked down for the night. Reed's journal, discovered in his personal effects and donated to the State Historical Society by his family, provides a window into the psychological toll of working in an environment designed to contain human misery. His handwriting deteriorates over the 18 years of entries, becoming increasingly erratic as his reports become increasingly bizarre. March 15, 1897. Heard singing from Block D during night rounds. Block D evacuated for repairs since February. Investigated. No source located. June 3, 1899. Cell 47 door found open during morning inspection. Lock mechanism intact. Key accounted for. No explanation. October 22, 1903. Distinct sound of multiple voices in conversation, originating from execution chamber. Chamber secured and unoccupied since Friday's proceedings. Reed's reports were dismissed by his supervisors as the products of exhaustion and imagination. Night work was known to play tricks on men's minds, and the prison environment was acknowledged to be particularly stressful. But Reed was not the only guard to report such experiences. Between 1890 and 1910, 17 different officers submitted informal reports of unexplained sounds, unexpected door operations, and the persistent sensation of being watched by invisible observers. The convergence of these reports around a specific location was noted by the guards themselves, if not by their supervisors. Cell 47 in Block D appeared with unusual frequency in their accounts. The cell had been the site of 2 inmate suicides and 1 homicide between 1882 and 1895. It had been temporarily decommissioned due to persistent plumbing problems, sewage backup, and water intrusion that defied attempts at repair. But even when empty, Cell 47 seemed to generate more than its share of disturbances. Guards reported the sound of violent impacts against the interior walls, sounds consistent with a human body being thrown against stone surfaces. They described rhythmic banging that would continue for hours at a time, always stopping abruptly when direct investigation was attempted. By 1905, the guards had begun to avoid Cell 47 during their night rounds, walking past it quickly and avoiding direct observation of its interior. The cell acquired a reputation that transcended normal institutional gossip. It became known, in the informal language of the guards, as the Poltergeist cell, a designation that would outlive most of the men who created it. The overcrowding crisis began gradually, almost imperceptibly, like water rising behind a dam. The prison had been designed to house 480 men in individual cells. By 1885, it held 247. By 1892, it held 689. By 1901, the population had reached 943, more than 4 times the design capacity, with no end to the growth in sight. The mathematics of overcrowding were brutal and precise. Individual cells measuring 5 feet by 7 feet were now expected to house 2, sometimes 3 prisoners. 35 square feet of living space, originally inadequate for 1 man, was divided among multiple occupants who had no choice but to exist in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for livestock. The plumbing systems, installed in 1876 and designed for the original population, failed catastrophically under the increased demand. Sewage backup became routine. Water pressure dropped to levels that made basic sanitation impossible. The smell of human waste permeated entire cell blocks, creating health hazards that the prison's medical staff was powerless to address. Dr. Marcus Webb, who succeeded Dr. Jenkins as prison physician in 1887, documented the health crisis with increasing urgency in his annual reports to the state legislature. Tuberculosis rates among prisoners exceeded those of the general population by a factor of 12. Dysentery was endemic. Skin diseases spread through the overcrowded cells like wildfire, resistant to treatment and impossible to contain. But the most significant health problem was not physical but psychological. Men who had committed individual crimes were being forced to live in conditions of unprecedented intimacy with strangers, enemies, and rivals. The cell blocks became pressure cookers where every minor disagreement could escalate into violence, where every personal habit could become a source of conflict, where every moment of every day was shared with men who had nothing to lose. The noise complaints began in 1898 and escalated rapidly. Residents of Moundsville, living in the hills below the prison, reported that sleep had become impossible. The sound of 900 men confined in inadequate space carried down the hillside like the roar of a distant waterfall, constant, overwhelming, inescapable. The complaints were not merely about volume, but about the character of the noise itself. The sounds emerging from the prison at night bore little resemblance to the orderly routines documented in official reports. Instead, residents described a kind of acoustic chaos, screaming that would begin without warning and continue for hours, rhythmic banging that suggested coordinated protest or ritual, and an underlying current of sound that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Mayor Franklin Ross of Moundsville filed the first formal noise complaint with the state in December 1898. His letter, preserved in the legislative archives, describes sounds of such intensity and disturbing character as to render normal residential life impossible. Moreover, he reported that property values in the neighborhoods closest to the prison had declined by 30% as families moved away to escape the nightly assault on their peace. The prison administrator's response was to install sound-dampening materials in the cell blocks, thick curtains, acoustic panels, and insulation designed to muffle the worst of the disturbances. But these measures addressed the symptoms rather than the cause. The pressure inside the facility continued to build, and pressure, like water, will always find a way to escape. By 1902, the noise had taken on a life of its own. Residents reported that the sounds from the prison seemed to follow patterns that had nothing to do with the official schedules of the institution. The loudest disturbances occurred during the early morning hours when the prisoners should have been sleeping. The most unsettling sounds emerged during periods when the facility was supposedly quiet and controlled. Something fundamental had changed in the character of the institution. The machine designed to impose order through architectural authority was producing chaos. The building intended to contain and control human behavior was generating new forms of violence and desperation. The pressure had reached a critical point, and the walls themselves seemed to be preparing for what would come next. The first cracks appeared in 1903, hairline fractures in the load-bearing walls of Block D, so subtle that they were initially dismissed as normal settling. But settling should have been completed within 5 years of construction. These cracks were appearing 28 years after the prison opened, and they were growing. The prison's chief engineer, Harrison Clark's successor, attributed the cracks to thermal expansion and contraction due to inadequate climate control. But thermal expansion does not typically create the branching, organic patterns that were spreading through the stone walls like the roots of some underground plant. These cracks followed stress lines that suggested forces beyond normal structural physics. The cracks appeared first in the areas of highest population density, the overcrowded cell blocks where 3 men lived in spaces designed for 1. They radiated outward from points of maximum pressure, creating fracture patterns that seemed to map the psychological geography of the institution. The deepest cracks appeared near cell 47, the source of the most persistent disturbance reports. The repair estimates were staggering. The structural damage could not be addressed through normal maintenance procedures. Large sections of the building would need to be rebuilt from the foundation up, a process that would require the temporary relocation of the entire prison population. The cost would exceed the original construction budget, and the legislature had no appetite for such expenditures. so the cracks were patched rather than repaired, painted over rather than addressed, documented but not corrected. The building was literally holding itself together through habit and momentum, its structural integrity compromised, but its daily operations continuing as if nothing had changed. The clock continued ticking, but the rhythm was different now. The mechanical precision of the early years had given way to something more organic, more chaotic, more alive. The building had learned to breathe with the collective respiration of nearly 2,000 confined men. It had learned to pulse with their heartbeats. It had learned to crack under the weight of their accumulated despair. And in Cell 47, in the deepest part of Block D, something else was learning. Something that would outlast the guards who feared to approach it, outlast the prisoners who whispered its legends, outlast everyone except the stones themselves. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in October, and it announced itself with the sound of thunder rolling uphill from the river. But there was no storm that morning. The skies above Moundsville were clear, the air sharp with the first hint of winter, and the thunder was coming from inside the walls of the West Virginia Penitentiary. October 15, 1919. 6:47 a.m. The morning count had just begun when prisoner 1847, a man named Samuel Korchek serving 25 years for armed robbery, refused to stand for inspection. Officer James Patterson, walking his regular route through Block C, repeated the command. Korchek remained seated on his bunk, staring at the stone wall of his cell with the expression of a man who had suddenly realized that he had nothing left to lose. The confrontation that followed lasted exactly 14 minutes. Patterson radioed for backup. Korchek barricaded his cell door with his mattress and the iron frame that had served as his bed for 8 years. The sound of the mattress being dragged across the stone floor carried through the ventilation system to every corner of the prison, and nearly 2,000 men stopped what they were doing to listen. The silence that followed was more ominous than any sound. For 47 seconds, the West Virginia Penitentiary was completely quiet. No talking, no movement, no sound except the distant hum of the electrical transformers and the whisper of air moving through the heating ducts. Then prisoner 0934 in Block A began to bang his metal cup against the bars of his cell. Within 30 seconds, the sound had spread to Block B, then Block D, then throughout the entire facility. The rhythm was not random. 2 sharp strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, as if nearly 2,000 men had suddenly learned to speak the same language. The sound built and echoed and amplified until the walls themselves seemed to pulse with it, until the iron bars vibrated in their stone sockets, until the acoustic environment of the prison had been transformed into something approaching a war drum. Warden Marcus Dalton, who had governed the institution since 1911, later described the sound as the heartbeat of hell itself. His emergency report to the state capitol, filed 3 hours after the incident, noted that the rhythmic banging could be heard clearly in downtown Moundsville, more than a mile away. Windows in the administrative building cracked under the sonic pressure. The glass in the warden's office developed hairline fractures that would never fully heal. The riot that followed was less a coordinated uprising than a collective nervous breakdown. Men who had been confined in spaces too small for human habitation, who had been living in conditions that violated every principle of dignity and sanity, simply stopped pretending that the system deserved their compliance. Cell doors that had seemed impregnable were torn from their hinges. Locks that had operated flawlessly for decades suddenly jammed or broke or opened without keys. The improvised weapons told the story of desperation refined by intelligence and necessity. Bed frames became crowbars. Toilet fixtures became hammers. Shoelaces became garrotes. Men who had been declared too dangerous for society demonstrated that they had been learning every day for years how to transform the materials of their confinement into tools of rebellion. But the most disturbing aspect of the uprising was not the violence itself, but the precision with which it unfolded. The prisoners seemed to understand the building's vulnerabilities better than the guards who patrolled it. They knew which doors could be forced and which could not. They knew which corridors provided access to the administrative areas and which led only to dead ends. They knew which sections of the electrical system controlled the locks and which powered the communications equipment. Prisoner 1623, a man named Michael Torres who had spent 14 years studying every inch of his confinement, led a group of 17 inmates through a series of maintenance tunnels that did not appear on any official blueprint. These tunnels, carved from the limestone foundation during the original construction, had been forgotten by everyone except the men who lived their daily lives inches from the stones. The tunnels followed the path of least resistance through the bedrock, winding beneath the cell blocks like arteries beneath skin. They provided access to the building's mechanical systems, its electrical grid, and its structural supports. For 43 minutes, Torres and his followers controlled the prison's central nervous system, able to kill power to entire wings, lock or unlock cell doors throughout the facility, and monitor guard communications through jury-rigged radio equipment. The response time was 18 minutes longer than official protocols required, not because the guards were poorly trained or inadequately equipped, but because the building itself had turned against them. Doors that should have opened remained closed. Corridors that should have provided clear passage were blocked by debris that seemed to appear from nowhere. Communication systems failed at critical moments, leaving rescue teams isolated and confused in a structure that had become alien to the men who worked there every day. The blueprints, consulted frantically during the crisis, proved to be worse than useless. The building that existed bore little resemblance to the building that had been designed. 44 years of modifications, repairs, and improvised solutions had created a structure that followed its own logic, obeyed its own laws, and served its own purposes. Captain Morrison, now 67 years old and serving his final year before retirement, found himself trapped in a facility that no longer made sense. The routes he had walked every day for 25 years led to dead ends. The keys he had carried for decades would not open doors that had never given him trouble. The prison had become a maze, and he was as lost as any of the prisoners he had spent his career guarding. The design flaws that had been dismissed as minor inconveniences during normal operations became critical vulnerabilities during the crisis. The electrical system, retrofitted multiple times to accommodate modern equipment, failed in cascading patterns that left entire wings without power or communication. The plumbing, overtaxed for decades, ruptured under the stress of the riot, flooding corridors and making movement treacherous. But the most significant failure was architectural. The prison had been designed as a machine for controlling human behavior, but the human behavior it was designed to control no longer existed. The men confined within its walls had evolved beyond the assumptions of their captors. They had learned to think collectively, to plan systematically, and to exploit every weakness in the system that confined them. The isolation that was supposed to break their spirits had taught them patience. The overcrowding that was supposed to make them docile had taught them cooperation. The deprivation that was supposed to crush their will had taught them to survive on nothing. The prison had created exactly the opposite of what it intended, and the result was 43 minutes of carefully orchestrated chaos that nearly brought down the entire system. During the riot, as guards retreated to defensive positions and prisoners controlled large sections of the facility, something unprecedented occurred in Cell 47. Officer Thomas Reed, now 53 years old and still working the night shift, had taken shelter in the observation tower overlooking Block D when he witnessed what he later described as the impossible made manifest. Cell 47 had been empty for 16 months, decommissioned due to persistent plumbing problems and structural damage that made it uninhabitable even by prison standards. The door was secured with a heavy chain and padlock, installed after the last attempt at repair had failed catastrophically. But during the riot, Reed observed the door of Cell 47 opening and closing repeatedly, the heavy chain moving as if manipulated by invisible hands. Reed's incident report, filed 2 days after the riot ended, describes the phenomenon in language that struggles between bureaucratic precision and existential confusion. The door would slam shut with enough force to rattle the entire cell block, then swing open slowly, as if someone inside was testing the mechanism. The pattern continued for 7 minutes, synchronized with no other activity in the prison, following no logic that Reed could understand. But Reed was not the only witness. Prisoner 2001, a man named David Crawford, who had been confined in the adjacent cell for 3 years, confirmed the report in sworn testimony during the post-riot investigation. Crawford's account was particularly unsettling because he had been living next to cell 47 for long enough to know its normal acoustic profile: the sounds of settling, the effects of temperature changes, the routine noises of an old building under stress. What Crawford witnessed during the riot bore no resemblance to normal structural behavior. The sounds emanating from cell 47 were rhythmic, purposeful, and unmistakably violent. He described impacts against the interior walls that seemed to follow the same 2-3-2 pattern that had characterized the riot itself, as if something inside the empty cell was participating in the uprising. The structural analysis conducted after the riot revealed that cell 47 sat directly above a section of foundation that had been compromised during the original construction. The unstable soil pockets noted in the 1867 engineering reports had created subsidence problems that affected the entire east wing of the facility. Cell 47, positioned at the convergence of multiple stress lines, had absorbed decades of structural movement, settling, and vibration. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the consulting engineer brought in to assess the riot damage, theorized that the accumulated stress in the foundation could have created resonance effects that would amplify vibrations throughout the cell. The riot itself, with its coordinated rhythmic banging, could have triggered harmonic responses in the building's structure, causing sections of the facility to vibrate at frequencies that would simulate human activity. But Dr. Hartwell's explanation, while scientifically sound, could not account for the specificity of the phenomenon. Why cell 47? Why that particular pattern? Why during the riot and not during the countless other disturbances that had occurred over the decades? Her report, submitted to the state in December 1919, concluded with an unusual recommendation. Cell 47 should be permanently sealed and removed from service. The structural irregularities in that location present ongoing risks that cannot be adequately addressed through normal repair procedures. The recommendation was ignored. Cell 47 remained in service for another 36 years, accumulating incident reports, maintenance requests, and unexplained phenomena until it finally achieved a reputation that transcended normal institutional folklore. It became the heart of the prison's mythology, the place where architecture and human suffering had combined to create something that defied rational explanation. The aftermath of the October riot revealed the true extent of the structural damage that had been accumulating for decades. The stress fractures that had appeared sporadically since 1903 had spread throughout the facility, creating a network of weaknesses that threatened the building's integrity. The repair estimates were catastrophic. 1. $2 million in immediate repairs. 3. $7 million in structural reinforcement. $890 in electrical system upgrades. $2. $3 million in plumbing replacement. The total exceeded $8 million, adjusted for inflation approximately $127 million in today's currency. The legislature would have found it cheaper to demolish the existing prison and build a new one from scratch. But demolition would require acknowledging that the original design was fundamentally flawed, that 44 years of operation had been based on false premises, that the state had spent nearly half a century torturing men in the name of justice and reform. Such admissions carry political costs that elected officials rarely find acceptable. So the damage was patched rather than repaired, painted over rather than addressed, documented but not corrected. The building continued to operate, but it was no longer the same building. Something essential had changed during those 43 minutes of chaos. Some threshold had been crossed. Some boundary had been breached. The prisoners who had participated in the riot were transferred to other facilities or placed in solitary confinement, but the knowledge they had gained could not be transferred or confined. They had learned that the prison was not as strong as it pretended to be, that its authority rested on consent rather than physical force, that the machine could be stopped by men who understood its weaknesses better than its operators understood its strengths. The guards who had lived through the riot carried their own knowledge, the understanding that they were not in control, that they had never been in control, that their authority was an illusion maintained by routine and habit rather than any real power. The building they worked in every day had revealed itself to be something alien, something hostile, something that followed its own agenda. The acoustics of the facility had changed permanently. The riot had altered the resonance characteristics of the cell blocks, creating new patterns of echo and reflection that made ordinary conversation carry farther than it should, that made whispers audible in distant corridors, that made silence impossible to achieve. The building had learned to eavesdrop on its own inhabitants. But the most significant change was in cell 47 itself. The empty cell had somehow participated in the riot, had demonstrated agency that transcended normal physics, had revealed that the boundary between architecture and consciousness was more porous than anyone had imagined. The guards began to avoid cell 47 not just during night shifts, but during daylight hours as well. Maintenance requests for that section of Block D were routinely delayed or ignored. Cleaning crews would skip cell 47 and clean around it, leaving it to accumulate dust and debris like a shrine to something that everyone acknowledged but no one wanted to name. The prison continued to operate, but it was operating under different rules now. The machine designed to impose order had learned to generate chaos. The building intended to contain human evil had become something approaching evil itself. The boundaries between the watchers and the watched, between the controllers and the controlled, between the living and the dead, had become permeable. And in the silence that followed the storm, in the careful routines that were re-established to create an illusion of normalcy, everyone waited for the next breakdown, the next crisis, the next moment when the true nature of the institution would reveal itself again. The machine was still running, but it was no longer running according to plan. The scandals broke like a fever in the spring of 1958, when a series of investigative reports published in the Charleston Gazette-Mail forced the state legislature to confront what everyone had known, but no one had been willing to acknowledge. The West Virginia Penitentiary had become a monument to institutional failure, a machine that consumed human beings and produced only suffering, violence, and shame. The first article, published on March 17, 1958, carried the headline, "Hell on Earth. Inside West Virginia's House of Horrors." Reporter Margaret Sullivan had spent 3 months investigating conditions at the prison, interviewing former guards, released prisoners, family members of inmates, and medical professionals who had worked within the system. Her findings read like an indictment of everything the state had claimed to represent for the past 82 years. The numbers were devastating in their precision. Average cell size, 35 square feet. Average number of occupants per cell, 2, 7 men. Daily caloric intake per prisoner, 1, 847 calories, well below the recommended minimum for adult males engaged in physical labor. Medical staff ratio, 1 physician for every 823 inmates. Annual mortality rate, 4. 2%, nearly 8 times the rate in the general population. But statistics could not capture the human reality that Sullivan's investigation revealed. She documented cases of prisoners who had spent years without seeing sunlight, men who had developed rickets and vitamin deficiency diseases that belonged to another century. She interviewed former guards who described routine beatings, sexual assault, and psychological torture that had been normalized through decades of institutional practice. The medical records, obtained through a court order after the state initially refused to release them, told stories that challenged the boundaries of human endurance. Prisoner 3247, confined to solitary for 18 months, had been found eating his own hair and fingernails to supplement the bread and water diet that constituted his only nutrition. Prisoner 2891 had attempted to perform surgery on himself using a sharpened spoon, trying to remove what he believed were electronic devices implanted in his abdomen by the guards. Dr. Robert Chen, who had served as prison physician from 1954 to 1957 before resigning in disgust, provided Sullivan with documentation of medical neglect that bordered on deliberate cruelty. Broken bones left untreated for months, infected wounds allowed to fester until amputation became necessary. Mental illness ignored until prisoners became catatonic or violent beyond any possibility of recovery. "I became a doctor to heal people," Dr. Chen told Sullivan in an interview that appeared on the front page of the April 3rd edition. "What I witnessed at that prison was the systematic destruction of human beings carried out with bureaucratic precision. I could not continue to participate in what amounted to state-sponsored torture. The psychological evaluations, conducted sporadically and filed away without follow-up, documented the progressive mental deterioration that affected nearly every long-term prisoner in the facility. Men who had been confined for more than 5 years showed signs of what Dr. Chen termed institutional psychosis, a condition characterized by complete withdrawal from reality, inability to function outside of prison routines, and a form of learned helplessness that made rehabilitation impossible." The suicide rate told its own story. Between 1950 and 1958, 47 prisoners had taken their own lives within the walls of the West Virginia Penitentiary. The methods were as varied as they were desperate: hanging from makeshift nooses constructed from bedsheets, self-inflicted wounds using contraband knives, deliberate overdoses from hoarded medications, and in one case, death by dehydration after a prisoner simply stopped eating and drinking. But the official records did not include the deaths that were classified as accidents or natural causes, but which everyone understood to be suicides by proxy: prisoners who deliberately provoked fights with more violent inmates, who accidentally fell from high places, who suffered heart attacks at ages when healthy men should not die. The real suicide rate, Dr. Chen estimated, was probably 3 times the official number. The most damning evidence came from the guards themselves. Men who had spent years implementing policies that they knew were inhumane, but had felt powerless to change. Officer William Garrett, who had worked at the prison for 14 years before suffering what he termed a crisis of conscience, provided Sullivan with a detailed account of the institutional culture that had evolved within the facility. "We weren't guards," Garrett told Sullivan. "We were participants in a system designed to drive men insane. Every day, you watched human beings deteriorate a little more. Every day, you contributed to that deterioration just by showing up for work. After a while, you had to choose between quitting or becoming something you didn't want to be. Most of us became something we didn't want to be." Garrett described routine practices that had never appeared in official manuals, but were passed down from one generation of guards to the next, like trade secrets: the deliberate manipulation of cell assignments to create conflicts between prisoners, the selective enforcement of rules to reward informants and punish troublemakers, the use of solitary confinement, not as punishment for specific infractions, but as a tool of psychological warfare against prisoners who maintained their dignity or sanity. The overcrowding had reached levels that defied human comprehension. By 1958, the prison housed 847 men in facilities designed for 480. Some cells contained 5 prisoners, forcing men to sleep in shifts because there was not enough floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Toilets were shared among groups of 12 to 15 men. Privacy had become a concept without meaning. The violence was systematic rather than random, Garrett explained. The administration had learned to use prisoner-against-prisoner violence as a management tool, deliberately creating conditions that would generate conflicts and then positioning themselves as the source of order and protection. Guards would arm certain prisoners and then stand back while they settled scores or enforced informal rules that served the administration's interests. But the most chilling aspect of Garrett's testimony concerned Cell 47 and the phenomena that had made it notorious throughout the facility. By 1958, Cell 47 had been empty for 6 years, officially decommissioned due to structural problems that made it uninhabitable. But the cell continued to generate incident reports with disturbing regularity. "Every guard who worked that wing had stories about Cell 47, Garrett told Sullivan. Sounds that couldn't be explained, doors that opened and closed by themselves, temperature changes that didn't make sense. But the worst part wasn't the supernatural stuff. The worst part was that it felt like the cell was watching us, like something in there was keeping track of what we did, how we treated the prisoners, what kind of men we were becoming. The court documents unsealed as part of Sullivan's investigation revealed that the state had been receiving complaints about conditions at the West Virginia Penitentiary since 1923. Letters from family members, reports from visiting clergy, formal complaints from defense attorneys, medical assessments from outside physicians, all documenting the same patterns of abuse, neglect, and institutional dysfunction that Sullivan was exposing 35 years later. Federal Judge Harrison Bradley, reviewing the accumulated evidence for a class action lawsuit filed by the American Civil Liberties Union, described the West Virginia Penitentiary as a deliberate and systematic violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. His preliminary ruling, issued on September 12, 1958, declared that continued operation of the facility under existing conditions would constitute a federal crime. The financial costs of the scandal were immediate and devastating. Property values in Moundsville plummeted as potential buyers learned about the horrors that had been conducted in their community for more than 8 decades. Tourism, which had provided modest revenue to local businesses, disappeared overnight as visitors associated the town with institutional brutality rather than scenic river views. The insurance liability alone threatened to bankrupt the state. The class action lawsuit sought damages on behalf of every prisoner who had been confined at the facility since 1920, potentially affecting tens of thousands of men and their families. The estimated liability exceeded $47 million in 1958 dollars, approximately $485 million in today's currency. But the political costs were even more severe. Governor William Marland, who had been elected on a platform of government reform and fiscal responsibility, found himself defending a system that embodied everything voters claimed to oppose. The prison had become a symbol of government incompetence, official cruelty, and the gap between public rhetoric and institutional reality. The federal intervention that followed was swift and uncompromising. The Department of Justice launched a civil rights investigation that would ultimately involve 47 federal agents, 12 attorneys, and a budget that exceeded the annual operating costs of the prison itself. The FBI established a field office in Moundsville specifically to investigate decades of potential civil rights violations. The evidence they uncovered exceeded even the worst expectations of the federal investigators. The systematic torture that Margaret Sullivan had exposed in her newspaper series was documented in official reports, memoranda, and policy directives that revealed a level of institutional sadism that shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. The preliminary indictments, unsealed in December 1958, charged 17 current and former prison officials with violations of federal civil rights laws. The charges included conspiracy to deprive prisoners of constitutional rights, deliberate indifference to serious medical needs, and the use of excessive force under color of law. If convicted, the defendants faced federal prison sentences that could exceed their own careers in corrections. But the most serious charge was institutional, the allegation that the West Virginia Penitentiary had been operated as a criminal enterprise disguised as a correctional facility, that the state had knowingly and deliberately created conditions designed to inflict maximum suffering on prisoners regardless of their crimes or sentences. The timeline for closure was established by federal court order rather than state decision. Judge Bradley's final ruling, issued on March 15, 1959, gave the state 18 months to either bring the facility into compliance with constitutional standards or cease operations entirely. The compliance requirements included reduction of prisoner population to no more than 600 men, installation of adequate plumbing and medical facilities, elimination of solitary confinement for periods exceeding 30 days, and structural repairs that would cost an estimated $23 million. The state legislature, facing the choice between massive expenditures and institutional humiliation, chose humiliation. On September 8, 1959, Governor Marland announced that the West Virginia Penitentiary would be permanently closed within 12 months. The decision was presented as a victory for progressive penology and fiscal responsibility, but everyone understood it as surrender to federal authority and public shame. The transfer plans were developed in secret to prevent the kind of resistance that had characterized prisoner movements in the past. Buses would arrive before dawn. Prisoners would be loaded in groups of 12 with no advance notification and no opportunity for organized protest. The transfers would be completed over a period of 6 weeks, gradually emptying the facility until only the guards, administrators, and ghosts remained. Some prisoners, as it turned out, would refuse to leave. Men who had spent decades confined within those walls had developed a psychological dependence on their captivity that made freedom more terrifying than continued imprisonment. They had learned to survive in conditions that would destroy most human beings, and they were afraid that release would expose their inability to function in a world that had moved beyond their understanding. The resistance, when it came, was passive rather than violent. Prisoners would simply refuse to board the transfer buses, sitting in their cells with the resigned determination of men who had already lost everything and were prepared to lose what little remained. The guards found themselves in the unprecedented position of trying to force prisoners to accept freedom. The last days of the West Virginia Penitentiary were characterized by a strange combination of relief and dread. Everyone wanted the nightmare to end, but no one knew what would happen to a building that had absorbed more than 8 decades of human misery. The stones themselves seemed to remember every scream, every beating, every moment of despair that had occurred within their embrace. Cell 47, which had been empty for 8 years, would remain empty until the end. But on the night before the final closure, Officer Thomas Reed, now 71 years old and working his last shift before retirement, made one final entry in his unofficial journal. June 30th, 1960. Cell 47 door standing open. Chains still in place, lock intact. No explanation possible. Building remembers what we choose to forget. The machine was finally shutting down, but the memory would continue running long after the last prisoner had been transferred, long after the last guard had walked away, long after the silence had settled over the empty corridors like dust on a tomb. What happens to a prison when it's empty? The question would be answered in the years to come, when the building would reveal that some machines, once started, never truly stop.